This afternoon promises to be a very interesting session. I'll be sending around the attendance sheet. Please sign to stay in contact. Our chair for this afternoon is Professor Thomas Metcher from the University of Bremen. Isn't it, Thomas? Yes. He's known to quite a few of you from previous visits to the school, and I'd like to hand over now to Thomas.
Session of this summer school. It is a really hot and complex subject, the international weakness of the left in face of the capitalist economic crisis. Well, we have three speakers, 20 minutes each, so I was told by the powers that be. The first one is John Boyd, Secretary the campaign against Eurofederalism in Britain, London-based, former engineer. He's editor and author in The Democrat, which has a wide circulation data service. The second one is Horst Teubert from Cologne, a journalist and German foreign policy analyst. He was also published on the re-emergence of fascism in Germany. He's one of the editors of the internet blog German Policy.com and contributes regularly to Die Junge Welt, which is, in my view, the leading radical left-wing daily in Germany. And the third speaker is Owen O'Moradu. I'm sorry. I think my German tongue needs some training to get around your very venerable and highly esteemed sounds. So you forgive me. He is a former political editor of the Irish language radio station. He is commentator and journalist, political analyst, born in London, of Irish background, and with personal connections to understand with Desmond Greaves. So the first speaker will be John.
It's a complex subject, and I'm deliberately controversial, so I hope it provokes a bit of discussion. I did happen to know Desmond Greaves, worked with him on the Irish question in the Connolly Association, which I still belong to, and he persuaded me to take up the EU question and to form an organisation, which we did in 1992. That is CAFE, or the Campaign Against Eurofederalism. And the way I'm going to approach this subject is to continue what Desmond has written in these two papers. So it's important that you get hold of this. Charlie is at the front of the building selling them. So if you want to know the lead up to what I'm saying, you have to buy the pamphlet. So my objective today is to recap Desmond Greaves' papers published in this pamphlet, The National Question. And when I was naive about the national question, I realised that was important, and I went to Desmond Greaves and said, you know, the problem is the national question. And he quite politely and good-humouredly said, I know. This pamphlet covers the period from the Second World War up to the Single European Act, 1985. He wrote the second paper. So it's the Doog Committee which met in Ireland in secret till it was exposed what it was up to. And I'm going to continue that through to the present day treaties, into the current situation, and indicate where the left has failed at several points. So just recapping what Desmond wrote down. He said at the time that after the Second World War, Britain was economically broke, had lost an empire, lost much influence in the world, and ended up dependent on the US military machine to protect its own interests across the world, which were many and still are many today. And as part of a one-sided special relationship, I don't think it's a special relationship, I think it's one-sided, dominated by the US, as has been shown a couple of times recently. The European Economic Community began in 1956 with the Rome Treaty with 6 member states. Britain, Ireland and Denmark joined the EEC in 73, marking the desertion of the nation state by the ruling classes. They just abandoned the nation state. Britain was the 6th former empire to join 5 other broken empires in what is a temporary alliance, and it is only temporary. The Thatcher government in 79 introduced the free movement of capital, marked by the lifting of all restrictions on capital movement. This supported the transnationals and removed an important power of the nation state. And in fact, my late brother-in-law was a chef on duty from an agency, and he was in the Tower of London cooking their dinner, and she was meeting bankers, and it was after that meeting that the government declared this free movement of labour. They didn't know that there was a connection with the chef and me. A distraction amongst the left at this time was Eurocommunism, emanating mainly from Italy and Spain, which included changing the EEC from within and leaning heavily towards what's ended up as social democracy. In 1984-85, the year-long miners' strike and defeat took place as part of the deindustrialisation and handed the energy market to the oil and gas transnationals at that time. The first treaty after the original Rome Treaty is the Single European Act of 1985, put in place in 1986 because you lot in Ireland delayed it 1 year. And Raymond Crotty, of course, was the pivot point in that campaign in Ireland. In contrast, this treaty was rubber-stamped by Westminster with only one lonely Labour MP drawing attention to the SEA. I'm afraid I've forgotten his name, but I didn't know him at the time. The left and Labour movement paid no attention whatsoever to the consequences of this important treaty. The Single European Act was the basis of the single currency and European single market, defined as the free movement of capital, services, goods and labour. They said people, but it really means labour. The treaty also further developed the military aspect of the EU, which a lot of you in Ireland drew attention to and opposed. The view advocated at this time by Desmond Greaves was that the EEC would enable capitalism to be reinvigorated and that the EEC would act on behalf of private capital. In practice, this is done by using institutions of the EU. These included the unelected and unaccountable Commission, Councils of Ministers, and European Court of Justice. The tools used have been common policies, directives and regulations and other legislation. They have passed this legislation down the conduits to national governments and to the labour movements via the Social and Economic Committee and the European Trade Union Confederation, which is paid for by the EU mostly. In 1986, the so-called Big Bang occurred, where restrictions on financial markets were lifted completely and occurred at the same time as the SEA. The economy of Britain and Ireland became based largely on financial services and conjuring up money out of money, so they thought. And objectives was to turn the City of London back into the most important financial centre of the world. That was their objective. In 1988, Commission President Jacques Delors went around selling social Europe to the labour movements in exchange for supporting the EU. And in Britain, the TUC just fell over and supported it without any mandates from their memberships or national councils or national committees. The Social Charter dates the serious split in the labour and trade union movement in Britain and across the EU. This strengthened the misconception that the only game in town was Brussels, expressed by the GMB German Secretary and TUC President at the time, John Edmonds, which is a view that still persists. At the time, it was seen as a way around the draconian legislation of the Thatcher government, instead of acting nationally by the labour movement and taking action against social Europe. And I fully appreciate that trade unions today and since then have to work within what's available to hand, including the EU, but it doesn't prevent the trade unions having a policy opposed to EU membership. The deindustrialisation of Britain continued with the loss of shipbuilding, the steel industry, coal mining, and most importantly, manufacturing. And I, in fact, wrote a pamphlet in 1986 called The Murder of British Industry, published by, incidentally, Connolly Publications. It wasn't published by an English oriented, it was published by Connolly Publications, linking it to the EEC and its common policies, which indicates that the Connolly Association was really in front of everybody else in the British labour movement. Trade union membership was 13 million in 1979 and compared with 6.5 million today. The switch of the economy from manufacturing to the financial sector and services removed the ability to create wealth and trade by Britain. Simultaneously, as with the decline of the labour movement, communities were broken up, including social life in factories, around coal mines, steelworks and public transport. I used to go to dances at the London Transport Works in Chiswick and Acton, where workers were able to meet, discuss and so on. Those factories have been flattened to the ground, don't exist anymore. And other factories. I used to go to work passing AEC Works, which produced all London buses. It was level to the ground and I had to sit the other side of the train so I didn't have to look at this grass. Today, even public houses are no longer the centres of communities. 300 pubs are closing every week, which is a denial of community life, meeting and so on, even meeting rooms. The television and car transport, as Desmond pointed out, have turned people into unsocial individuals. You can see the lack of social thought even by walking along the pavement with people on the tube. One claim, in fact, by the establishment is that colour TV, would put an end to the aspirations of the 1844 Communist Manifesto. And that was in a broadcast, that was the claim. Around the 1990s, the USSR and other socialist countries collapsed, removing the beacon of socialism, this causing delusion amongst the left and putting capitalism back into the nation states from where it had been ousted decades before. In 1992, the Thatcher government in Britain passed harsh anti-trade union legislation to restrict secondary picketing and that unions must hold ballots before taking strike action. So you couldn't have the shop steward saying, right, everybody out. You had to go through the legal process of holding ballots, which of course could have stopped a lot of action. The objective was, of course, to head off any resistance and make it extremely difficult to take industrial action. Trade unions failed to stand up to this legislation, and that must lay at the left's fault in not agitating for this harder. The Maastricht Treaty of 1992 was the next treaty. This consolidated the euro as the single currency. In one stroke, this was to turn the thing into an EU superstate and cull many nation-state powers. Britain, as the centre of sterling, and Denmark, with a strong anti-EU movement, obtained an opt-out from the euro, and others are very pleased that we're not in the euro, Ireland joined and broke the link between the punt and the sterling and the republic with the 6 counties. The social charter at the time was turned into the social chapter and stuck in the back of the Maastricht Treaty, but it had no legal standing really. Social Europe was made official along with other illusions like a level playing field. In 1994, Clause 4 was deleted from the British Labour Party's constitution, which removed socialism and turned that party into a social democratic party. This was not long after Mrs. Thatcher declared that every vestige of socialism should be eliminated from Britain. In the year 2000, the next treaty was the Nice Treaty. This introduced codified majority voting, which subjugates smaller EU member states to the larger ones, especially Germany, France, Italy and Britain. This treaty was subject to 2 referendums in Ireland. You don't get the message, do you? And a rubber stamp in Britain. Following this, there was the industrial dispute over Irish ferries, if you remember. That was a taster of what they were going to do, where cheap labour was introduced. The European Court of Justice used free market EU legislation to attack both collective bargaining and long-established trade union rights. The prominent cases that were mentioned yesterday were Laval. There was also Ruffert and Luxembourg and the Viking ferries. They regard posted workers, and I think that was explained yesterday, where you just import into a country cheap labour, worse conditions and so on, and pose problems for the host country's labour movement. And of course that legislation is based on the free movement of labour, which favours employers. At the same time, it is against national trade union rights, collective bargaining, and the interests of the working class and small businesses in general. The next stage after Nice to consolidate Eurofederalism was the European Constitution, developed with no consultation from the peoples within the EU. This was rejected by the electorates in France and Netherlands, to the great surprise of the EU top dogs, but regurgitated as the unreadable Lisbon Treaty. Once again, you lot in Ireland rejected it, and you had to hold 2 referendums to get it right, but other member states weren't given that opportunity. The Constitution was put in place in 2009 to complement the single currency and the Eurozone. Since then, finance capital and the Eurozone have been and remain in crisis. Unemployment is rampant across the Eurozone at 12%, where youth unemployment tops 60%. Attacks on social protection and welfare states are still in full swing, and we in Britain have still got more rounds of this, although we're not in the Eurozone. So, to summarise the implications of the European Union, it takes away all forms of democracy: formal, where you vote; practical, where you shift taxes from rich to poor; and informal, where you can go and lobby. If you want to lobby on something now, you have to go to Brussels or to Strasbourg, where the European Parliament sometimes meets. The EU is the antithesis of democracy. At the same time, it removes the powers of the nation state and centralises them with a government in Brussels that can't be removed by the electorate. In a nutshell, as Greaves pointed out, the EU undoes the French Revolution. It also undoes the American Revolution, which was part of the struggle for independence, establishing the right to self-determination of nation states, and it also undoes the half-English revolution of the 17th century to put an end to the divine right of monarchs to rule. The role of austerity is common across the EU, and it's also active in Britain, as it is used as a further means to exploit and hand everything to the transnationals and the private sector, and they're not finished with us yet. It's also to apply every pressure, including legislation, to make us work longer and harder in order to compete and improve what they call efficiency. In other words, you workers of the world, you've got to compete now, not unite, and to increase the surplus value and profits for those that hold the money. That is why the size of the workforce can be and is being reduced. They don't care if there's a big unemployment, because they'll just screw more out of the rest of us. And it has also started to take away even the ability to earn a living. What are these young people going to do? They're 60% unemployed. They emigrate, but in the end, where are you going to emigrate to? These policies are permanent. They're not temporary. Once they've got them in place, that's it. Because it has undone decades, in some cases hundreds of years of struggle to get the rights and the conditions that we have, or did have. These are applied in many other countries like Australia, Canada, and in South America now. So the current form of capitalism, the EU has got to be set in this current form of capitalism, which is dressed up as benign globalisation. A nice word, but it covers an awful lot of evils. The real role of globalisation is a cover for crypto-imperialism, which is a term proposed by Desmond Greaves. I think it's a very good term which we should adopt. The EU has developed a European army, including rapid reaction forces, to carry out the EU's foreign policy on behalf of the former empires. It may not be too visible, but it's there and can be put into operation. The impression of globalisation is that it is a global village, some village, in which there is one large pool of money floating around, in which we all have to compete, where nation states are irrelevant. The next stage of arranging matters is now with us and takes the form of free trade agreements, FTAs. These FTAs are to extend the principles of the free movement of capital, services, etc. across the globe. There is on the table the EU-India Free Trade Agreement, the US-EU Free Trade Agreement, which if it goes through will be the end of the NHS in Britain. And FTAs are being drafted for most of the former colonies of the European powers. So why then has the left failed to combat all this and stop it taking place? So the left remains split over support for and against the EU superstate. This, I think, is as serious as the split over the First World War, where socialists ended up as cannon fodder, fighting and killing each other in the trenches. That legally brings us back to James Connolly and the post office and Pearse Street and this building. So some on the left mistakenly will not work with the right, and the right do not understand the left or the Labour movement. That's my experience in trying to work in this sphere. Also, the left has failed to recognise the true nature of the EU and capitalism today, where transnational corporations and banks have no further use of national democracy or nation states. The left has failed to appreciate the importance of the national question, and in particular the key importance and role of nation states today as the only means to control private capital. The left has also failed to protect the communities. Why let loads of pubs and meeting places shut down? We should go out and help the communities defend these places. The left has failed to understand that internationalism depends on respect for nation states and requires national independence and democracy. The left has failed to mount a campaign in Britain to rescind the anti-trade union legislation. It's still in place and is used all the time. The left has failed to expose austerity as a common EU policy that shifts wealth and yet more control into the hands of big private capital, where governments don't care a damn about the social consequences. The procedure involving sovereign debts is like a revolving sign. The bailout loans with huge interests are made by banks. The government concerned applies austerity cuts and taxes on the population. These draconian policies are stipulated by the Troika, IMF, Commission and ECB, and the banks. The loans are then paid back to the banks, not to the governments. The banks then makes another bailout loan, more austerity is applied, and the scythes continue once more in their cycle. The people are impoverished, the economy stalls, and privateers join in the harvesting financial resources and capital. The left also, in Britain anyway, has failed to unravel racism, immigration and the free movement of labour, which has been mixed up with misunderstanding of what real internationalism and solidarity is. The left has failed to expose as untrue the claim that the single European market provides jobs, where in Britain it's said that 3 million jobs depend on the single market. It's a total lie, and that there's no future alone outside the EU. The left has failed to elaborate and explain EU factors and policies which impinge on many areas of economic life, such as those directives which privatise state-controlled and nationalise industries and services. In Britain, the one shining example is the RMT union over railways, compared to the postal services, the CWU, where the leadership has denied for years that there is an EU directive which says there must be competition in postal services. They're now paying the price because it's going to be privatised in the next few days. And I think, personally speaking, going on strike at this late stage to stop it is a bit of a waste of time, but nevertheless they'll have a go. And up to and into the economic crisis, as we on the left, we have simply not worked hard enough to explain all this. So I take some of the blame. The alternative which the left must develop as a matter of dire urgency requires different policies, and they should include the following. A call by the left for an increase in wages, a reduction in hours, and a lowering of the retirement age to replace austerity. This would reduce unemployment and challenge the transnationals. There is enough made out of surplus value and profits to do this. You don't have to work longer and harder. It's part of kidology. The left has to develop a viable and acceptable alternative policy to EU membership and reject the advice given by transnational corporations who want to keep their factories in Britain and so on, and the US, which says Britain must stay in the EU. The left has to show there is life outside the EU and to develop a viable alternative with an economy based on manufacturing, the creation of wealth and trade across the world, including EU member states. Otherwise, what the hell is the working class going to do? Nation states must control their national borders and control the movement of capital, goods, services and labour. We don't want to stop immigration or asylum or anything like that, but you can't have millions of people wanting to come to Britain, and if the EU-India free trade agreement goes through, we'll have loads of unemployed from India coming. Britain should cease paying into the EU to the tune of 12.2 billion a year net, plus 1.4 billion to the European Investment Bank to prop up the Eurozone, to prop up your loans and your debts. Surely, shouldn't Ireland stop paying into the ECB and default on the sovereign debt. If I own the bank £2,000, I'm in a bit of trouble. If I own the bank £2 million, the bank is in trouble. So I think that should be put across. But that's up to you in Ireland and not me to tell you. The left must further emphasise the role and powers of the nation state as the only means to control private capital and to default on the sovereign debts as Iceland has done. To achieve a better understanding of the national question is required, including nationalism and internationalism. This must be the focus of political action, in other words, to overcome what has for too long been a serious blind spot and have a revolution of sorts against the EU and capitalism if we can do it, or suffer the barbarity which is down the road if we don't do that sort of thing. Finally, the left must shout loud and clear that to achieve the right to self-determination, including the right to have socialism if the people so desire, a nation-state must have the prerequisite of national democracy and independence. The left should and must be in the leadership of an anti-monopoly alliance against the EU. This must include the trade unions. This requires a large measure of unity which does not exist on the left in Britain. We've got 6 or 7 communist parties, 4 or 5 socialist parties. That's not, they all shout unity, that's not unity. And the legacy of James Connolly and Desmond Greaves still stands for getting Britain and Ireland out of the EU and for Britain to withdraw from the 6 counties of Northern Ireland. I'll draw attention to this pamphlet again, and to While on Social Europe is a con there on sale outside. Thank you for listening and your attention.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. I'm really glad to have the chance to speak here. I'm from Germany and I'm speaking from a German point of view. I think because the European Union is unfortunately not comprised of 28 member states all being equal, but some of them being more equal than others. I think that gives the German point of view maybe a certain significance even for Ireland. From a critical German point of view, the current Euro crisis seems to have a lot to do with the weakness of the left, especially with the weakness of the German left. The reason lies in the fact that the various German governments in the past 2 decades have been able to impose a severe austerity policy, at first not on the EU but on Germany. This has led to far-reaching consequences for the EU as a whole. But before looking at those consequences, it's important to look at the reasons why the German governments have imposed an austerity policy on the country. It was not just an accidental occurrence, it was well thought out. For the German establishment, austerity policy is of strategic importance. Of course, low wages and poor social benefits are always in the interests of big business and the ruling elites in any country in the world. But for the German establishment, it is more than just that. Germany's revenue and German wealth come in a high degree from exports. In the second half of the 1980s, and again from 2003 until 2008, Germany was the world champion in exports, only losing this position in 2009 to China. From the point of view of the German establishment, China, whose exports continue to rise quickly, has become one of the main economic rivals in the fight for shares in the world markets. If you want to compete with China, one thing is sure, the lower the wages paid, the better the chances to win. So, for the German establishment, austerity policy is a very important means to compete with China and to maintain the traditional German path to wealth. Moreover, there is an aspect which derives directly from the special situation of Germany after the Second World War. After 1945, Germany had lost its former military power. It was allowed to rebuild an army, the Bundeswehr, in 1955, but the Bundeswehr was not strong enough to compete with the French and British armies, not to mention the United States Armed Forces. The allies of the Second World War would clearly not have allowed Germany to adhere further to its traditional military power policy. For this reason, the German elites had to find other ways to realize their wish to become more powerful in the world, and very soon they took up an idea they had stuck to after having lost the First World War, the idea to wield power by means of a strong economy. For this reason, strengthening the German economy has been for the German establishment not just a matter of wealth, it has also been a matter of power, far more than for any other of the big Western states. The austerity policy the German elites imposed on Germany with the aim to compete on the world market has had at first severe consequences in Germany itself. Real wages were cut, social welfare was reduced drastically, especially during the chancellorship of the Social Democrat Gerhard Schröder. According to a study published by the OECD, between 2000 and 2005, we then had a red-green government. Poverty in Germany rose faster than in any other Western country. When the red-green government was voted out of office in 2005, poverty in Germany lay for the first time above the OECD average. But beyond this, the German austerity policy has also had severe consequences for the EU, especially for the Eurozone. Due to shrinking wages and social cuts, German companies were able to produce cheaper goods and to sell more and more of them, not only on the world market generally, but especially to other European countries, like, for example, France, Italy, Spain, and Greece. This was possible because in the years before the euro crisis, these countries did not follow the German austerity model for reasons which I will mention later. Indeed, they finally lost competitiveness to Germany. Take, for example, France. In April 2010, when the euro crisis escalated, Jacques-Pierre Rougon, an expert with the Paris-based Institut de Relations Internationales et Stratégiques, stated in the well-known newspaper Le Monde that in France, the cost of labor had risen from 2000 to 2009 by about 17%. Obviously, not only French companies but also French workers took profit from the economic growth. Jacques-Pierre Rougon compared this with Germany and stated that during the same decade, the cost of labor in Germany had shrunk by 1.3%. Obviously, German workers were denied a proper share of the economic growth. As Jacques-Pierre Rougon realized further, France had had an export surplus of 39 billion euro in 1999. 10 years later, things had changed decisively. Now, the country bought much more than it sold and had an export deficit of 43 billion euro. One main reason was that Germany, pushed by its austerity policy, had increased its exports not only generally on the world market to the damage of competing French exporters, but also its exports to France. The latter meant that France was paying more and more money to buy German products and fell ever deeper into debt. This has continued until today. In 2012, German exports to France rose to 104.5 billion euro, whereas French exports to Germany only reached 64.8 billion euro. This means that in the end, France had to pay about 40 billion euro net to Germany in 2012 alone. It is not unusual that the economies of different countries develop differently. Generally, states have the means to react if another national economy becomes too strong. They devalue their currency. Since the euro was introduced, the Eurozone countries obviously no longer have this means. They can't protect themselves against an ever stronger German economy and thus run ever deeper into debt. This is where you could say that the euro crisis has something to do with the weakness of the German left as well as with the euro, because the German left has not been able to prevent the various German governments from imposing a severe austerity policy on the country, increasing the state of imbalance between the national economies of the Eurozone countries and driving other Eurozone countries so heavily into debt. Of course, the German elites will tell the world that the opposite is true, that their austerity policy is the best line of action that must be followed in all Eurozone countries, and then all will be well. This is exactly how the Eurozone countries have steered under German domination in the last 3 years, but this is a path leading to poverty all over Europe, and so I would tend, and I think you as well, to believe that one should change course. If you do want to change course, the question is, for me as a German, why did the German left not fight hard enough to prevent the austerity policy at first in Germany? I think there are different aspects which have to be taken into account. One general aspect which is connected to German history should not be neglected. It is about the political culture in Germany as a whole. The people of Germany have never won a fight for a revolution or toppled a dictator in their own country as people have in other European states. For example, the revolution in 1848 failed. In 1871, the German Reich was founded by waging a war against France, while important figures of the German left were imprisoned. Democracy was introduced in 1918 because the Kaiser had lost the war and had to step down. Germany had to be liberated from the Nazi dictatorship by the Allies. Resistance inside Germany had been completely insufficient. Resistance from the left was decimated immediately in 1933 because leftists either had to flee or were imprisoned. Many of them in the first concentration camps, many of them died. It would be an illusion to believe that this history and this historical experience should, generally speaking, have no influence in Germany today. Sometimes you can realize this really practically. For example, if you look at some minor events, one such event was a demonstration in Hanover on the 23rd of April in 2009. The tire manufacturer Continental, Conti we call it in Germany, whose headquarters is located in Hanover, was planning to shut down a factory. The workers protested and went to the streets. Business as usual, one should believe. The unusual thing was that the factory, which was to be shut down, was situated in Clairvaux in France, and the workers who staged protests in Hanover were French workers. In Germany, it is known that French protesters used to be far more resolute and powerful than German protesters, so the police in Hanover took special measures. They printed leaflets in French, which is absolutely uncommon in Germany, telling the French workers that they had to behave decently and that in Germany it was forbidden to burn tires if you stage a demonstration. Even German trade union officials were concerned and joined the protests, asking their French colleagues to keep quiet. But it really happened. Of course, this is only a small detail, but it's quite a typical one, and it might give you an idea why it is easier by far for the German establishment to impose an austerity policy than it is, for example, for the French elites. This aspect is an important part of what the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, a conservative newspaper, had in mind when in March 2012 it pleaded for a cultural revolution in Europe. The south of Europe, the newspaper wrote, having not only Greece, Portugal, Spain and Italy, but also France in mind, the south of Europe should adjust its political economic culture to the German model. If you try to find out why there were and are no sufficient protests against the austerity policy in Germany, you will have to look at the German system of social partnership as well. For example, at the beginning of 2010, the conservative newspaper Die Welt praised trade unions and works councils at the big chemical company Lanxess for having introduced new forms of collaboration. It quoted a unionist saying, "The crisis transformed us from members of the works councils into co-managers." In April 2012, the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, this well-renowned conservative newspaper, wrote approvingly, it's a quotation, "Instead of ideologists eager to strike, there are even more co-managers in the leading circles of the trade union head offices and in the works councils." It is clear that German trade unions are even instrumental in imposing the German austerity policy on the EU. At least the Deutscher Gewerkschaftsbund, or German Confederation of Trade Unions, has initiated some intuitive measures which aim at preventing trade unions in crisis-torn countries to protest against austerity in a way, let's say, like burning tires, like the continental workers in France. In December 2011, Michael Sommer, the chairman of the German Confederation of Trade Unions, met with Chancellor Angela Merkel to talk about the euro crisis. They agreed publicly that the EU fiscal pact should be complemented by some spending programs to improve the social situation. The austerity policy itself was not called into question. 4 months later, the DGB, chief of the German Confederation of Trade Unions, invited trade union chairpersons from 8 other European countries to 2 meetings in Berlin. One with Chancellor Angela Merkel, the other one with one of the leading Social Democrats, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, former foreign minister. After the meetings, the DGB chair declared that the EU fiscal pact should be complemented by spending programs. Again, the austerity policy was not called into question as a whole. With the meetings in Berlin, the German Confederation of Trade Unions has integrated leading trade union officials from Belgium, Sweden, the Czech Republic, France, Italy, Spain, Greece, and even Ireland. In the last 3 years, the euro crisis has led to growing opposition to the euro in Germany. There's a left opposition against the euro, mainly in the party The Left, whose majority is, however, pro-euro. One reason why the left opposition against the euro is relatively weak in Germany is that the German elites traditionally used a very chauvinistic policy to become more powerful in the world. During the Nazi era, their policy was even openly racist and anti-Semitic. Many in Germany, in the German left, hope that a European policy will at least prevent the worst. I don't share that opinion, but it is there. On the other hand, a right-wing opposition to the euro has grown and it is currently placing its focus on the party Alternative for Germany. At its core, the party is an instrument for those members of the German economic elites who are of the opinion that saving the euro is too expensive and too risky and sooner or later will drag the German economy down. If you take a closer look at the party, you will find that some of its leading figures are in touch with the far right. Maybe worse, some party members or party supporters who belong to influential parts of the German elites are known for having voiced explicitly anti-democratic proposals. For example, one leading member of the Alternative for Germany suggested denying the right to vote to the jobless. In spite of these concerns in part of the German elite, a clear majority in the establishment defends the euro, not only because Germany profits the most from the single European currency, but also because an abolition of the euro would be a severe blow for the EU as a whole. From the point of view of the German establishment, the EU is a very important instrument which affords them influence in the world, the fact being obvious that Germany alone is too small to compete politically or even militarily with other great powers like the United States or the People's Republic of China. This is one reason why it was very important for Germany to get through the Treaty of Nice and the Lisbon Treaty, both of which respectively pursue a European or a common security and defense policy. The aim is to pursue common foreign policy even with the help of the military, with all the strength of all EU member states together. This has far-reaching consequences because it means that the national foreign policies of all EU member states have to be melted together in one single European foreign policy, something which is impossible without a severe power struggle between the strongest European states. Having been the most influential EU member state for a long time, Germany has emerged from the euro crisis as the undisputable leader of the Union. The magazine Internationale Politik, International Policy, a very renowned German magazine, stated plainly at the beginning of 2011, and now it's a quotation, a structural question of the European Union was clarified in 2010. Germany, with the largest national economy, has definitely emerged as the central player in the Union. To put it bluntly, Merkel is no longer just Germany's chancellor, but the European Union's as well. The role of the vice chancellor certainly falls to the French president, and the quotation goes on, who has the leeway to take the initiative in a policy debate, but could be roped in by the chancellor Merkel should they disagree. Indeed, economically, the French president has in the meantime been roped in several times when he tried to escape from German austerity dictates. Currently, Germany is trying to dominate the common security and defense policy as well. This can be seen in the attempts to build an EU army. Germany clearly wants an EU army, the reason being that the Bundeswehr is weaker than the British and French armies and that it doesn't have nuclear weapons, so Germany would benefit from the common armed forces. If Berlin secures its dominant position in the EU, it will be able to form the common security and defense policy according to its own foreign policy goals. This explains why London and Paris signed a binational declaration on defense and security cooperation in November 2010, agreeing on common armaments projects and building of a combined joint expeditionary force, because clearly France and the UK are not in favor of Germany's domination over every policy field. Of course, the German establishment is fully aware of that and is trying to discredit the pact between London and Paris. In August 2012, the German Council on Foreign Relations called this treaty a new Entente Cordiale, and it warned that it should be dealt with cautiously. the Entente Cordiale, being the pact between the UK and France before the First World War. Two things seem to be clear. There will be no possibility for any EU member state to stay neutral in future wars. The building of an EU military bloc will comprise all of them. Second point, the German elites see the militarization of the EU as one of the main elements of the Union. The German Foreign Minister Guido Westerwelle set up the Munich Security Conference in February 2010, no, it's a quotation. The European project of a common security and defense policy will be an engine with which Europe can grow together. If you know German history, you might recall how Bismarck in 1871 forged the German state out of the many smaller German kingdoms and principalities. He waged a war against France, melting all the principalities together and securing Prussian domination over the militarized German Reich. Of course, no one is obliged to give his or her consent to the militarization of Europe. It would be a good idea for the German left, but also for the left in other European countries, to fight against it. It's not a fight without hope, as can be seen by the no of the British Parliament to war against Syria. It would also be a good idea to fight austerity policy in Germany as everywhere in Europe, and I think most of you will agree. But it surely will be good to keep in mind that militarization and austerity are no accidental occurrence, but part of the core strategy of the strongest EU member state, this being Germany. Thank you.
Dus by the way, weegas gwaith was a critical bwtwm tahta das lawyd. Le rwdbeg ffatis yn o'i reir y hasym, mae'r ni lysag am wyl ffragri agam yn y bwn cert yn y sio. Fwy cetol y dynaf, cetol dynaf gymicha. Ysreid y tas anes gan an cain y dynaf, tas e wad nis diagra an balacharaya amsiw. I understand, obviously, that after several hundred years of foreign rule, of oppression, of national catastrophe, and all the rest of it, that most of us don't have the ability to follow a debate in our own native language. So I will use a foreign language on this occasion. Just to help, and I appreciate my pronunciation of my name, O'Murchul. It's one of those difficulties that many people express, including in our own country, because our language is not taught as a speaking thing for the children in our schools. And there's only things like the thing that was on the Late Show the other night, where we saw Colossal Lurgan adapting a lot of modern music to an Irish language scene and setting, giving it, I think, a new vibrancy and a vividness. That is the real struggle for the recovery of our language, our culture, of our existence as a nation. And but that struggle is one which doesn't take place in the abstract. It takes place in a certain context, and that context is the ability to live and earn a living. And in that sense, we have to deal with all the problems that the whole world conjures up for us. We live essentially, I think it's fair to say, and it is recognised now, in what is a dysfunctional state. Very, very few Irish people believe that the state that has emerged after the defeat, effectively, of our struggle against British imperialism in 1921 has been adequate to the tasks of meeting the aspirations of the Irish people for a change and for a new Ireland and for a real Ireland. We have, back again now, appalling levels of emigration, accepted by the government almost as a good thing because it lowers our social welfare bill. And we have increasing numbers of young people who cannot see any hope, any way to stay and work and live decently in their own country. And we see that the anger which exists in Ireland about austerity is shared throughout Europe, but is particularly virulent here as opinion polls, one after the other, show big majorities of 75–80% opposing austerity, thinking the government is doing a lousy job. But when it comes to presenting alternatives, to making a choice about what to do, we find that almost the same proportions consistently fall back in voting for the parties which are imposing austerity. We see in Greece a more vibrant resistance to austerity. Riots, strikes, demonstrations. And yet, when it came to choosing a government, even a party like Syriza, a party of the left, though a party I think with a rather ambiguous position on the question of the euro, was not the victor. It was a party of neoliberalism, a party firmly committed to austerity and to many other anti-democratic practices which came out on top in the Greek elections. And here in Ireland, in the latest test that we had, the by-election in Meath East, we see the parties which favour austerity, Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and the Labour Party between them, amassed 3/4 of the votes cast in that by-election. Labour was humiliatingly trounced, but that, I believe, is not enough. So what I want to look at is the debate about why are the working class so angry, so embittered, so furious, unable to translate that into any concrete action. Now I want to begin in a sense with two quotations. The first is a comment of Engels, and I say that because I was searching desperately to actually find the exact words going through various texts, but I didn't. But I remember this very clearly. The first is a comment of Engels to the effect that at the end of the day, the working class has only two weapons in its fight against capitalism: theory and organisation. Now, it has been part of received Marxism that the capitalist mode of production itself provided the basic organisation because workers stood together at their labour in factory and workshop. They constantly interacted with each other at work, and this interaction provided the context for using the organisation forced on them in labour for other purposes, including a discussion of the improvement of their conditions. In building sites until recently, when we had building sites, break time was a time of discussion, not just of sport, but also of politics, of arguments about spending, of arguments about aid, of arguments about the nature of Irish society. But these, I think, John Boyd mentioned it in relation to England, of factories which have been levelled and destroyed. We see that this is not the way the workforce is presently organised, at least in the peripheral states. What we find is an atomisation of the working class, of workers existing in small, isolated units, often existing as individual units. We see a pattern where many companies have, if you like, turned their workers into self-employed companies. There used to be at one time, the various dairies had milkmen who delivered milk to people's houses. That was replaced by all of those individuals being given the money to set themselves up as individual companies, and they then are responsible for their holidays, their sickness, everything else that happens to them. They are also without the day-to-day context of meeting together as a workforce and responding together as a workforce to the things that happen. That is one of the crucial weaknesses which we have to analyse as to how do we go back to the radical roots of the working class movement, which won all of these important concessions to give us the context in which to improve our lives. How can we win back that context? So there is a need to analyse that change and to find a new way to use the new situation of work, nevertheless to bring back the collective context and collective interaction of workers. And theory. The theory of an alternative and how to get it is one which has been confounded by confusion and difference. John has mentioned 7 communist parties, 4 or 5 socialist parties, God knows how many democratic alternatives in Britain. The question is that the working class, in terms of people thinking, in terms of people having the ability to define what is socialism, how will a socialist society function, what are the alternatives to the existing capitalist situation, all of those are confused and disparate and essentially weak. And there are, of course, 2 contexts for that. The first is the failure of Soviet communism, the failure of communism in Eastern Europe. As a communist myself, obviously I am proud of the things that were achieved in social advances, in economic advances, in the development of the concept of the 5-year plan and all the rest of it. But at the end of the day, the system failed. And we can't pretend to the working class here that it didn't fail. And one of the problems of workers when you talk about socialism is to say, well, what do you mean? People who had it rejected it. And they did that for a reason. So we have to analyze the failures of that system internally so that we can use that experience not to be bogged down in the rut of that, but to show that it wasn't all bad. There are things that can be built on, there are things that can be recovered, and that there is a way forward for the working class, because socialism cannot just be a lethargic, unmoving, undialectical mass. It has to be a living experience, continuing to develop, continuing to respond to the realities of changing life. I'll come back to some of those ideas later if I have time. But my second quotation, which is related to all of that, is one from the Gaelic revolutionary Martin O'Kane, writing, as he said, "Ma fodlach to Nearish Gaelach," as an unrepentant Republican. And I think a lack of repentance for our championing of straightforward democratic views and socialist objectives is something we should all take to heart. But as an unrepentant Republican, O'Kane looked back on Irish history and he declared, "Sé an dóchas ekem riu an nál istana tíre, ná an waimu cuartach, an dóchas a gint a vishning, agus an mishnach a gint an gríth." The hope, he said, that I see back in the history of the country is the chain detonation. Hope generating courage, and courage generating action. And it is action that we have to see. To get the action, therefore, we need to reinstill hope. And that is a hope which is based upon rational analysis of honest descriptions of the experience which as a class we have gone through for the last 100, 200 years, and so on. And it is then when we can overcome the lack of belief in an alternative that it will be possible to transfer the anger that demonstrably exists into something more positive. Because ironically, at a time when capitalism should be on the ropes, with so much anger out there, with such a mess of its system, with its banking system shown to be such a contradiction of its own supposed principles and immutable laws of economics. At such a time, capitalism instead is moving forward to further restrict workers' rights in terms of trade unionism, further restrict workers' rights by the imposition of the so-called zero contracts. You can have a job, but you'll only be paid when you work, when we want you to work. In other words, you're not paid for your labour time, you're paid for the specific labour. In other words, a decrease in the amount of income that people will get. We see the lack of rights emerging in a whole range of the experiences of trade unions and working people in different areas in relation to entitlements, to state benefits, to welfare and so on, and to the most appalling idea championed by the Labour Party, God help us, that people of internships. Now, you'll never have a shortage of getting a job if you're willing to work for nothing, because that is the ultimate capitalist ideal. Look how good they are to us. They're allowing us to work. And by Jesus, it's a wonder that we don't have to pay them for that privilege. In this context, is it a wonder that so many of our young people, well qualified, well educated, well able, can see nowhere to go except Australia or Canada or wherever? That is the destruction of our country, which has been brought about by a total subservience, a subservience in which their lack of belief in the ability of an Irish state to provide for its people, because the Irish state could only do that on the basis of a more equal use of the resources of our country. And that of course means taking them away from the traditional rich, the old big farmers and those who dominated our retail sector of the capitalist economy. It means taking money away from that, using that to create new industries, which was done ironically by Fianna Fáil in the 30s, but then immediately as a prelude to giving it all back into private enterprise hands. And here we are, back again, full circle, with their attempts to resolve the crisis as being, we've got to return our banks to profitability so that the state's stake in them can be sold off and they can once again become efficient, functioning capitalist banks. And we, the working people of Ireland, will pay for that glorious outcome, in which they make the profits and in which we endure reduced working conditions and wages. Now, as I said, we can see an angry working class that has nowhere to go to express its anger. This gap is being filled to a considerable extent at the present time by Sinn Féin. At the same time, the legacy of the cul-de-sac of the armed struggle acts as a constant millstone, dragging that party backwards. And we do have to ask a very pertinent question. Can we be sure that the ideological development of Sinn Féin is strong enough that it will not compromise in the future? Now, by compromise, I'm not talking about the necessary tactical compromises of advancing a complicated struggle, or winning a bit here, maybe surrendering a bit there, but advancing again on another front. I'm talking about ideological compromise, where you actually give up your fundamental direction. It is a point, I think, which John has made very acutely in his own contribution. Because having a lack of faith in ourselves to do the things that are necessary, we look to these outside forces to resolve it for us. Our trade union movement, our popular democratic movements are overwhelmingly wedded to the idea that the euro is a good thing. The idea now that the response to the crisis should be a deeper integration of Europe and a further erosion of the sovereignty of a national state, a big factor in our acceptance of the last EU treaty. All of that stems, particularly in the terms of the labour movement, for its unwillingness and its refusal to engage in any critical assessment of what the European Union itself actually is, and what the new constitutions of the European Union are, the fact that to have a socialist economy is in fact constitutionally outlawed under the rules brought in by Nice, Lisbon and so on in the European Union, but most importantly, that all the measures which are necessary for us to take to defend ourselves in this economic crisis are stymied by the fact that we cannot control our currency. While we are members of the euro, we cannot refuse to shovel money into all these foreign banks to repay them the debts that have been imposed upon us. We can only refuse that by refusing the context of the bailout, by refusing the imposition of foreign rule from the ECB and the Troika and the rest, if we re-establish a currency of our own. And that is a debate, therefore, which those people who recognise the terrible circle ulach, the cycle of horror in which we are caught, that is where we have to put a huge amount of our energy to make that fight and to win that fight, to recognise that the freedom to have our own currency is the freedom to exist as a free people. Now, we want to look and see this question of why do people not have a faith, not just in Ireland, where we can put our own national experiences to bear, but throughout Europe. Why is it that the working class is so weak? I mentioned the failure of communism, the fact that while communism was there, while the Soviet Union was strong, the capitalist powers of the West were always afraid that the workers might follow that example and seize power. They were always afraid that there were limits on what they could do. Could they have waged the wars they've rolled out in Afghanistan, Iraq and all the rest of them if the Soviet Union had been as strong as it once was? I don't think so. But certainly I think the present situation over Syria, where decidedly non-communist Russia has nevertheless managed to completely wrong foot a US president who is increasingly displaying himself as an international clown. We can take no pleasure in that clowniness, if such a word exists, but it is a recognition that all power does not lie in their hands. And it is very important that they lose their effort in Syria, not because the Assad regime is a good one, not because the Assad regime refused neoliberalism. It in fact did the opposite. It brought in neoliberal economic policies and wiped out thousands of jobs, impoverishing many of its own people, which led to the initial demonstrations. But the reason is because the United States wishes to destroy one of the biggest obstacles to its domination of the Middle Eastern region, and in particular the use of its puppet state Israel as part of that project. So the collapse of the Soviet Union has had huge repercussions on our living standards, on the context in which we fight, and in the context internationally of how various events pan out. But what about the other trends within the labour movement historically? What about social democracy? When we look at the appalling sight of Hollande trying to once again revive Les Gloires de la France in a sordid international adventure of imperialist aggression. When we look at the sordid, dishonest, mendacious history of Tony Blair and that rampant Blairism which our own pathetic crew hold up as an example of newness and modernness of thinking. When we see all of that, when we see the way that PASOK has been wiped out in Greece on the ground, and deservedly so, when we eagerly anticipate the drubbing which we all hope to give with a real good solid boot to the Irish Labour Party whenever we get a chance to stamp them into the electoral ground, we see that social democracy is not necessarily something that has many positives behind it. But is the working class movement to reduce itself to a series of battles between the 7 communist parties and the 5 socialist parties and the 4 democratic movements? Or do we have to actually take a debate into the labour movement as a whole, into the trade unions, and indeed even into the Labour Party? For me, I see many people now leaving the Labour Party. I understand the principle and the integrity of the individuals doing it, but I wonder what the benefits of that are for the struggle that has to be made. Because the Labour Party will be smashed in the next election, but it won't go away. And the question is, we have to find a mechanism by which the genuine elements within that tradition can be brought into genuine action and play. And therefore the task which we have is the task of uniting the left. Not uniting on the basis of forgetting the things they are doing, not uniting on the basis of saying, oh well, maybe a little bit of austerity might be better than a lot of austerity, which seems to be the position adopted by some of the Labour Party's backbenchers. But a unity of the left which will be based upon declaring principles in advance, and principles, I think, which have largely been laid out by John Boyd there. The principle that we as a people have a right to make the fundamental decisions about our social, economic, political, and dare I say, cultural and linguistic life. That the road forward cannot exist if we do not confront the question of the euro and our need to disengage from it. That is a debate on which we have to challenge the David Beggs and indeed the Jack O'Connors as to what is the way forward. It is a comradely debate in the sense that O'Connor at least is part of the movement which will hopefully be the arena in which we struggle for an alternative to the subservience to austerity which we have at the moment. But it is a comradely debate which has to take place with a clear statement of the need to break with capitalism, to paraphrase Wolfe Tone, or to wrongly quote him, the never-ending source of all our present evils, and to unite communist, social democrat, socialist, genuine democrat, environmentalist, to invite all the plain people of Ireland in their various philosophical and ideological outlooks together under one common banner, an end to the corruption of a lousy elite who have misruled and misrepresented our country since they first signed their Treaty of Surrender back in 1921.
Well, thank you very much, and I thank all three speakers for their excellent contributions. The discussion, the panel is now open for commentaries and questions, but just before we start with the questions, I take the limited privilege of the chair to just add one additional, dimension to what has been discussing, not in the sense of a commentary or not a critique in no sense, but something which I think should be in our awareness. And I mean, Owen in his contribution had this dimension in it, namely the international dimension, which is in the title of this evening session, the international weakness of the left. And I mean, and all the weaknesses have been mentioned here. But I mean, if we take the word international now in a really precise sense, international today in what is called the global society. I don't like the term. I prefer to use the Marx Engels term of a cosmopolitan character of the production and consumption in advanced capitalism. But I mean, it's the same as meant. We live in a world society, and in one part of the world we have the left and some kind of socialism in advance and fighting, namely in South America and Latin America, with at least 3 countries which have programmatically on a socialist agenda, whatever this kind of socialism is like there. And they are fighting, and they are fighting strongly and against all odds. So the struggle continues, and I think much more so than in the past. I mean, the left in Europe should examine these examples, not as some people do, particularly in Germany, of the ultra-left in certain sections. Well, I mean, giving good advice, you see how they could do it better, but many things of which one could learn and study what is happening there. And just to put one point of their achievement, which I've just read in a long article in Junge Welt by Dieter Boris, where he points it out that one of the main achievements is that they have very much strengthened the nation state in these particular countries in close cooperation with the other Latin and South American countries. So a clear example also that the strengthening of the nation state does not exclude, in fact it includes the international relation and cooperation of a group of nations, in this case against imperialism. But I just want to open up this as a dimension on which we might or might not come back to in our discussion.